For 5 years, my husband's family made me eat holiday dinners alone in the hallway. My mother-in-law would smirk and say that farm girls did not belong at a proper table. They all laughed. My husband just kept cutting his steak without a single word of defense. On the 6th year, I did not cry. I simply took off my apron and boarded a midnight train to my parents' farm instead. 3 days later, my phone screen showed 99 missed calls from the people who had just thrown me away. I did not answer. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. The sharp clinking of heavy silver against imported fine china pierced the heavy silence of the dining room. We were gathered at the Evans family estate in the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, radiating an air of untouchable arrogance. She was a woman utterly obsessed with her status within the elite circles of Atlanta society. To her, appearances were everything, and I was a permanent stain on her carefully curated image. I stood near the doorway, holding a heavy serving tray filled with a sweet potato casserole. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing from scratch, using ingredients I had brought all the way from my family home. I had been awake since 4 inches the morning trying to make this Thanksgiving meal perfect, hoping that maybe this year things would be different. Beatrix did not even look at the food. Instead, she snapped her perfectly manicured fingers and pointed toward the narrow, dimly lit hallway just outside the dining room doors. A small, flimsy wooden folding chair had been placed there, completely isolated from the main gathering. "Farm girls do not belong at a proper table, Chloe," Beatrice announced, her voice carrying a theatrical sigh of burden. "The smell of fertilizer ruins the truffle butter. Take your plate and eat out there." I stood frozen, feeling the familiar hot sting of humiliation rising in my chest. This was my 6th Thanksgiving with the Evans family, and the cruelty had only escalated with each passing year. Sitting to my right was Brittany, the wife of my husband's brother, Darren. Brittany was a white woman from a wealthy family with old money ties, and Beatrice treated her like absolute royalty. Beatrice believed that having Brittany in the family elevated their social standing, proving they belonged among the highest echelons of wealth. Beatrice would constantly praise Brittany for her delicate features and her refined background while actively searching for ways to degrade my existence. Brittany took a delicate sip of her wine and let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Honestly, Beatrice is right," Brittany said, her eyes scanning me with pure disdain. "Besides, Chloe, your natural hair looks a bit wild today. I would absolutely hate for it to start shedding near the prime rib. We really need to keep the dining area sanitary." The blatant racism and classism, in her words, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a targeted attack meant to make me feel small and unkempt in a room full of people wearing designer clothing. I turned my eyes desperately toward my husband, Julian, praying that this time he would finally say something. Julian was a high-powered financial lawyer, a man who argued complex cases in courtrooms and commanded respect everywhere he went. A lucrative living handling wealth management for the Atlanta elite. But right now, sitting at his mother's table, he said absolutely nothing. He casually sliced a piece of rare Wagyu beef, placed it in his mouth, and continued chewing as if his wife had not just been degraded to the level of an animal sent to eat in the corridor. My hands gripped the edges of the serving tray so tightly that my knuckles turned white. For years, I had swallowed these insults, trying to keep the peace, trying to be the respectful and submissive wife Julian demanded I be. I had allowed them to treat me like an uneducated peasant, simply because I came from a rural background. But what these incredibly arrogant people refused to acknowledge was that my background was not a mark of shame. It was a legacy of immense pride and generational survival. I hold a double doctorate in botany and agricultural sciences. I spent years in university laboratories studying soil composition and sustainable farming techniques. My family owns and manages a sprawling 1,000-acre legacy farm in Georgia that has been passed down through generations of proud, hard-working Black farmers. It is a massive, sophisticated operation that requires immense intelligence, dedication, and scientific knowledge to run successfully. But to Beatrice and Julian, it was just a dirty vegetable patch. They measured worth entirely in designer labels, luxury vehicles, and country club memberships. They were completely blind to the true value of the earth and the people who cultivated it. They thought my dirt-stained hands were a sign of poverty, when in reality those hands were keeping a multi-generational empire alive. I looked at Julian again, watching him swallow his food and wipe his mouth with a linen napkin, completely indifferent to my presence. He did not care that I had spent hours cooking. He did not care that his mother was banishing me from the room. He did not care that his sister-in-law was insulting my heritage. I thought about how Julian and I first met. We were both attending a gala for young black professionals in Atlanta. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to respect my intellect. Hy told me he loved how grounded I was, how my connection to the earth made me different from the superficial women he usually dated. It was a beautiful lie. As soon as we were married, his true nature emerged. He did not want a grounded partner. He wanted a prop. He wanted someone he could mold into the perfect obedient wife to show off at his corporate retreats, while secretly looking down on my origins. He slowly began to isolate me from my family, complaining about the long drive to the farm and criticizing my parents' simple way of life. I had compromised so much of my own identity, trying to keep our marriage intact. I stopped talking about my research at dinner parties because it bored his colleagues. I wore the restrictive, uncomfortable designer dresses Beatrice picked out for me, just to avoid an argument. The illusion I had held onto for years shattered in an instant. I was not a partner in this marriage. I was a punching bag. I was the designated target for their deep-seated insecurities and desperate need to feel superior. I realized in that moment that Julian liked having me beneath him because it made him feel more powerful. Very slowly, I lowered the heavy serving tray onto the nearest side table, pushing aside a crystal vase to make room. I reached behind my back and untied the strings of the floral apron I was wearing. The dining room fell completely silent as the heavy fabric slipped from my shoulders. I walked deliberately toward the head of the table where Julian was sitting. I did not retreat to the hallway. I did not drop my head in shame. I walked right up to my husband, feeling a terrifying but exhilarating sense of clarity. I was never going to shrink myself to fit into their tiny, superficial world again. I held the apron suspended over his plate for a brief second before dropping it directly onto his perfectly cooked, expensive Wagyu steak. The heavy fabric smothered the meat, knocking over his wine glass and sending dark red liquids spilling across the pristine white tablecloth. "Enjoy the truffles, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady, refusing to let them see a single tear. "I am going back to the mud." Julian shot up from his chair so fast it nearly toppled backward, crashing into the wall behind him. The mask of calm, professional indifference vanished, replaced by a sudden explosive rage. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into my skin with terrifying force. "What do you think you are doing?" he hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes darting around the room to see if the household staff were watching this embarrassing display. "Do not make a scene, Chloe. Pick up that apron, apologize to my mother, and sit down right now." "Let go of me," I demanded, keeping my voice low but absolute. I pulled back, but his grip was like a vice. "If you walk out that door, you are done," Julian threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper intended only for me. "You think you can survive without me? You think you can go back to that pathetic dirt farm without my money funding your little lifestyle? I will lock our joint accounts before you even reach the end of the driveway. I will cut you off from everything, Chloe. You will not see a single dime of my wealth. You will be nothing." His arrogance was almost laughable. Julian actually believed his corporate salary was the only thing keeping me alive. He had spent so long looking down on my family and my profession that he truly thought I was completely dependent on his financial scraps. He had no idea what my family actually possessed or what I was truly capable of achieving without his suffocating presence. I yanked my arm with all my strength, breaking his grip and leaving red marks on my skin. "I do not want your money, Julian," I said, staring directly into his furious eyes, feeling completely detached from the man I once thought I loved. "And I do not want you." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room without looking back. Behind me, I could hear the sound of Beatrice loudly complaining about my lack of class and Brittany letting out a fake dramatic gasp of shock. I ignored all of it. I walked straight out the heavy oak front doors into the brisk November evening air. I had already packed a small travel bag earlier that week, hiding it in the hall closet because some deep instinct had warned me that this holiday would be the final breaking point. I grabbed my bag, pulled my phone from my pocket, and ordered a rideshare to the train station. The drive to the station was a blur of passing streetlights and silent reflection. I did not cry because I was losing Julian. I cried because I was mourning the years I had wasted trying to be loved by people who were fundamentally incapable of loving anyone but themselves. I had twisted myself into knots trying to fit into their elitist world, ignoring my own passions and hiding my own brilliance just to make them comfortable. That version of Chloe was dead. The train ride south toward my family farm in Georgia took several long hours. I sat in a window seat, watching the city skyline fade into dark rolling hills and vast stretches of open land. With every mile that passed between me and Atlanta, I felt a heavy, suffocating weight lifting off my chest. I thought about my father working out in the fields before the sun even came up, pouring his sweat and love into the soil. I thought about my mother managing the financial accounts of the farm with a sharp mind that could rival any Wall Street executive. They had raised me to be strong, resilient, and proud of my heritage. I felt a deep wave of shame for allowing the Evans family to disrespect that heritage for so long. But the shame was quickly replaced by a fierce, burning determination. I was going home. I was returning to a place where the soil was rich, where the air was clean, and where love was not measured by the brand of shoes you wore or the lightness of your skin. It was well past midnight when the train finally rolled into the small rural station. I stepped out onto the concrete platform, breathing in the crisp night air. It smelled like pine trees and damp earth, a scent that instantly grounded me and reminded me of who I truly was. The station was empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the loud, toxic environment I had just escaped. I pulled out my phone, intending to text my father to ask if he was awake and could come pick me up. But before I could open the messaging application, the screen illuminated with a sudden, urgent notification. It was a text message from my father sent just minutes ago. It was not a message checking on my well-being or asking about the holiday dinner. It was something else entirely. Chloe, the federal soil core samples came back. Get here now. Everything is about to change. I stared at the screen, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. We had allowed a team of government geological surveyors onto the far southern ridge of the property weeks ago, but my father had been highly skeptical of their claims, telling me not to get my hopes up. If he was texting me at this hour with this level of urgency, it meant the impossible had actually happened. My hands trembled as I read the words again, realizing that the life I had just walked away from in Atlanta was about to be eclipsed by something none of us could have ever predicted. The farm, the dirty vegetable patch that my husband's family had mocked and belittled for years, was holding a secret beneath its surface that would alter the course of our lives forever. I grabbed the handle of my small suitcase and began walking toward the main road, feeling a strange, powerful surge of adrenaline. The Evans family thought they had broken me. They thought stripping me of their fake elite status would leave me crawling back in desperation, begging for their financial mercy. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for me in the mud. The gravel road leading up to the Jackson family farm was exactly as I remembered it. The thick Georgia humidity wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, but for the first time in years, it felt comforting instead of suffocating. My boots crunched against the red dirt as I walked the final half-mile from the rural train drop-off to the main gates of our property. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. This land had belonged to my family for over a century. My great-grandfather had bought the first 50 acres with money he saved from working at a lumber mill, and every generation since had fought tooth and nail to expand and protect it. Now the farm stretched across 1,000 acres of prime agricultural land holding dense pine forests, freshwater springs, and miles of fertile soil. Julian and his mother, Beatrice, had always treated my home like it was a badge of poverty. They used the word rural as an insult, assuming that because my family worked with our hands, we were somehow beneath their Atlanta high society circles. They never bothered to understand the sheer financial and intellectual capital required to run a modern agricultural empire. As I approached the main driveway, I noticed something highly unusual. Parked alongside my father's heavy-duty pickup trucks and our large green tractors were 4 sleek black luxury utility vehicles. The kind of vehicles you usually only see idling outside corporate high-rises in the financial district. A group of 5 men wearing sharp-tailored suits and carrying thick leather briefcases emerged from the main barn. They were shaking hands with my father. My father was a tall, broad-shouldered man who wore his faded denim overalls with more dignity than Julian ever wore his custom Italian suits. He had a mind sharper than most corporate executives I had met in Atlanta. He saw me walking up the driveway and gave a firm nod to the men before turning his full attention to me. The men climbed into their vehicles, and the convoy of black cars kicked up a massive cloud of red dust as they drove away, leaving just the two of us standing in the early morning light. I dropped my small travel bag in the grass and walked into the barn. The smell of fresh hay and aged wood instantly calmed my racing heart. My father did not ask why I was home so early or where my husband was. He knew me well enough to see the exhaustion and finality in my eyes. Instead, he walked over to his large wooden workbench and picked up a thick stack of legal documents that bore the heavy seal of the federal government and the logo of a massive global green energy conglomerate. He handed the heavy stack of paper to me and told me to read the front page. I looked down at the documents, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. For the past several weeks, government geologists and private surveyors had been taking deep core samples from the unused southern ridge of our property. My father had kept it quiet, not wanting to stir up any false hope, but the results were officially in, and they were staggering. The Jackson farm did not just sit on top of fertile soil. According to the Geological Survey, our land rested directly above one of the largest untapped eco-friendly lithium deposits in the entire southern region, along with a massive, pristine underground water reservoir. The green energy conglomerate had been quietly searching for a domestic source of lithium to power their next generation of electric vehicle batteries. They needed our land, and they needed it immediately. My father pointed a callous finger at the bold numbers on the second page of the contract. The conglomerate had not just offered to buy a small section of the farm. They had proposed a 50-year exclusive lease and extraction contract that would allow them to build a state-of-the-art eco-friendly facility on our southern ridge, while leaving the rest of our agricultural operations completely untouched. The total valuation of the initial lease and the projected extraction royalties was $180 million. I stopped breathing for a moment, staring at the number printed in black ink, $180 million. It was a sum of money so vast it felt almost completely unreal. My father placed a heavy warm hand on my shoulder. He told me that he had already signed the preliminary agreements, but the final structure of the wealth management required my signature. Years ago, when my grandfather passed away, he had legally structured the estate so that I was the direct inheritor of 60% of the property and its associated mineral rights. My parents had wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, I would always have absolute control over my own destiny. The money was not just family money. 60% of that $180 million contract belonged directly and legally to me. As I stood there processing the sheer magnitude of what this meant, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting it to be another urgent email from the geological team. Instead, the screen lit up with a text message from Brittany, my husband's white sister-in-law. The message was dripping with the same racist, condescending venom she had displayed at the dinner table just hours ago. "Julian just locked all of your shared checking and savings accounts," Brittany wrote. "He told the bank you are no longer authorized to use his credit cards either. Hope you enjoy milking cows for minimum wage, sweetie. You should have just stayed in the hallway where you belonged." I stared at her pathetic little message, and a genuine wide smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in days. Julian had actually done it. He had thrown a temper tantrum and cut me off from a few $1,000s in our joint accounts, thinking he was handing me a death sentence. He thought he was leaving me destitute and desperate. He thought locking a piece of plastic would force me to come crawling back to his mother's house, begging for forgiveness. I was completely oblivious to the fact that I was currently holding a federal contract worth $180 million in my bare hands. I did not text Brittany back. I did not call Julian to argue about the bank accounts. I simply turned off my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and asked my father which field needed to be plowed first. For the next 3 days, I did not think about Atlanta. I did not think about high society dinners or designer dresses or the suffocating rules of the Evans family. I put on my oldest pair of denim jeans, a faded cotton shirt, and my heavy work boots. I went out into the fields and worked alongside my father in our farm hands until my muscles ached and my hands were covered in dark, rich soil. I used my doctorate in botany to analyze the crop yields and adjust the irrigation schedules, finding immense peace in the science and rhythm of the earth. Every time I wiped the sweat from my forehead and looked out over the vast expanse of our land, I felt a deep, powerful sense of ownership. I was not a charity case. I was not an uncultured embarrassment. I was a scientist and the primary shareholder of a multi-million-dollar green energy empire. It was late in the afternoon on the third day. I was kneeling in the dirt inspecting the root system of a new batch of heirloom tomatoes. The Georgia sun was beating down on my back, providing a comforting warmth. I had left my phone in the pocket of my jacket, which was draped over the fence nearby. I had kept the device on silent for the past 72 hours, wanting absolutely no interruptions from my past life. But as I walked over to grab my water bottle, I heard a persistent, aggressive buzzing sound coming from the fabric of my jacket. I pulled the phone out of my pocket and tapped the screen to wake it up. The sheer volume of notifications completely covered the display. There was one missed call from Julian. Then there were 15 missed calls. Then 40. As I scrolled down the list, I realized the number of missed calls had reached exactly 99. Julian had called 50 times. Beatrice had called 30 times. Even Brittany had called repeatedly. My messaging inbox was completely flooded with urgent, unread texts from every single member of the Evans family. These were not the people who had banished me to a hallway. These were not the people who had laughed at my heritage or mocked my natural hair. These were people who were suddenly panicking. I opened the most recent text message which had come through just 2 minutes ago from Beatrice. The tone of her message was so sickeningly sweet and desperate that it almost made my stomach turn. "Chloe, darling, we need you." Beatrice wrote her words practically dripping with fake affection. "Please pick up the phone, sweetheart. We are your family, and we miss you so much. Julian is absolutely heartbroken without you here. Please come home to your family right now. We have so much to talk about." I stood in the middle of the tomato field, the red dirt clinging to my knees and my hands, and I stared at the message. Beatrice Evans, the woman who had spent 5 years calling me a dirty peasant, was suddenly calling me darling and begging me to come home. She was not doing this out of love. She was not doing this out of remorse. The Evans family did not have a sudden change of heart. Something massive had happened in Atlanta while I was away. The fortune they worshipped so deeply had just shifted, and they were terrified. I locked the screen of my phone, slid it back into my jacket pocket, and went back to examining my plants. I knelt back down into the soil, pressing my fingers deep into the moist earth. The buzzing of the phone continued muffled against the heavy denim of my jacket, but I completely tuned it out. My mind raced trying to piece together the sudden, dramatic shift in the Evans family behavior. Julian was a man defined by his ego and his pride. For him to call me 50 times after explicitly threatening to cut me off meant that his fragile world was currently on fire. Beatrice calling me her darling meant that whatever crisis they were facing required something only I could provide. I thought back to the government contract resting securely in my father's heavy iron safe. The timeline was simply too perfect to be a coincidence. The energy conglomerate had finalized the press release for the lithium extraction deal just 24 hours ago. My father had mentioned that the financial newspapers and industry magazines were going to run the story early this morning. They were highlighting the historic nature of the deal, specifically praising the Jackson family for maintaining black ownership of the land for over a century before striking one of the most lucrative green tech deals in the history of the state. My name, alongside my academic credentials and my status as the primary inheritor, was undoubtedly plastered across the front pages of the morning financial reports. Julian worked in wealth management. Beatrice spent her entire life obsessing over the wealth and status of other families. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that they had woken up, poured their expensive coffee, and opened the Wall Street Journal, only to see the face of the woman they had just banished to a hallway, staring back at them as the newest member of the ultra-wealthy elite. The profound irony of the situation washed over me, making me laugh out loud in the empty field. Just 3 days ago, Julian had smugly locked my access to a joint checking account, holding a few miserable thousands, believing he held the power of life and death over my existence. Brittany had mocked my lack of income. Beatrice had deemed me unfit to sit in a dining chair. Now they were relentlessly blowing up my phone, desperately trying to reel me back into their toxic web because they realized they had just thrown away the heir to a $180 million fortune. I took a long, slow drink from my water bottle, looking out across the vast, endless green rows of the farm. The air was still and quiet, save for the distant hum of a tractor. The Evans family thought I was going to be an easy target. They thought my rural upbringing made me naive and pliable. They assumed that a few sweet words and fake apologies would be enough to make me forget the years of relentless emotional abuse and racial microaggressions. They probably thought I would come running back to Atlanta, eager to share my newfound wealth with the husband who had watched me be humiliated without uttering a single word of defense. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about farm girls. We know exactly how to spot parasites, and we know exactly how to eradicate them from our crops. I picked up my jacket, brushing the loose dirt from the sleeves. The phone had finally stopped vibrating, entering a temporary silence after its 99th missed call. I knew this quiet would not last. Julian was not the type of Anne to simply accept being ignored, especially when there was this much money on the line. If he could not reach me by phone, he would inevitably try to force a confrontation. He would use his legal background to try and find a loophole or a weakness he could exploit. He would try to use the marriage certificate as a weapon to claim what belonged to my ancestors. But I was not the scared, isolated wife I had been in Atlanta. I was standing on my own territory, surrounded by my own bloodline, and backed by a legal and financial fortress that my father had spent his entire life building. If Julian Evans wanted to come down to the mud to fight me for my family legacy, I was more than ready to bury him in it. I turned my back on the setting sun and began the long walk back to the main house. It was time to call my own lawyers. It was time to prepare for the storm that was undoubtedly heading south. The Evans family wanted to play a game of wealth and power, and I was finally holding all the winning cards. Let them come. Chloe walked up the wooden steps of the main farmhouse, leaving her muddy boots by the door. The screen door clicked shut behind her, blocking out the relentless hum of the Georgia cicadas. She walked into the cool interior of the kitchen and poured herself a tall glass of sweet tea. Her phone was still vibrating relentlessly against the solid oak table. 99 missed calls was no longer the peak. The number had easily crossed into the hundreds. Julian was desperate. Beatrice was desperate. The entire Evans family was likely having a collective meltdown in their pristine Atlanta mansion. Chloe ignored every single notification from her husband and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name of her private attorney. Denise Carter was a brilliant, ruthless corporate lawyer based in downtown Atlanta. She was a self-made Black woman who had built her own firm from the ground up, and she had absolutely no patience for the fake elitism of families like the Evans clan. Chloe pressed the call button and waited for her friend to answer. Denise answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp and immediately alert. "I was just about to call you. I assume your phone has been blowing up all morning. It has not stopped for 2 hours," Chloe replied, taking a slow sip of her iced tea. "Julian has called over 50 times. Beatrice is sending me endless text messages, calling me her darling daughter, and begging me to come home. Yesterday they banished me to a hallway and told me I was a dirty farm girl who did not deserve to eat at their table. Today they are acting like I am the absolute center of their universe. Why is the Evans family suddenly blowing up my phone? Denise, I need you to sit down for this." "Chloe." Denise said, her tone completely serious and devoid of its usual warmth. "The facade has finally cracked. The entire Evans family legacy is a complete and total sham." Chloe leaned against the kitchen counter, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean a sham? Julian is a senior partner at his wealth management firm. Beatrice sits on the board of half the charities in Buckhead. It is all smoke and mirrors." Chloe Denise explained, her words steady and deliberate. "The prestigious real estate investment firm that Julian and his brother manage is a massive Ponzi scheme. They have been running it for a decade. They use their social status, their country club memberships, and those lavish charity galas Beatrice hosts to lure in wealthy investors from across the state. They deliberately targeted elderly widows in their high society church groups, promising them massive returns on commercial real estate developments that never actually existed. They were just using the new money to pay off the old investors while skimming millions off the top to fund their luxury lifestyle." Chloe felt the breath leave her lungs. The designer suits, the imported cars, the sprawling mansion in Atlanta. None of it was real. It was all stolen money. They had looked down on her family for working in the dirt while they were literally robbing vulnerable people blind. The Federal Bureau of Investigation raided Julian's office at 8 this morning. Denise continued painting a vivid and terrifying picture. Dozens of federal agents stormed the glass tower in downtown Atlanta. They carried out boxes of financial records, seized every computer, and froze every single business account tied to the Evans family. Julian's pristine reputation is completely destroyed. He is currently facing dozens of federal charges for wire fraud and embezzlement. "How bad is the debt?" Chloe asked, her mind racing as she processed the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. "It is catastrophic," Denise replied. "The preliminary reports indicate that the firm is at least $40 million in debt. They owe money to some very powerful, very angry people. Julian and his brother are looking at decades in federal prison if they cannot find a way to pay off the immediate fines and make restitution to their largest investors. Chloe stared at the glass of sweet tea in her hand. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly clicking into place. Julian was $40 million in debt and facing federal prison. Yet, instead of calling a criminal defense attorney, he was relentlessly calling the wife he had just abused and discarded. "They do not know that I know about the raid," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a whisper as the realization hit her. "Julian locked my bank accounts yesterday, thinking it would force me to come crawling back to him. He thinks I am isolated down here in Georgia, completely unaware of what is happening in Atlanta." "Exactly," Denise said. "And that brings us to the real reason they are suddenly begging you to come home. Have you seen the morning edition of the Wall Street Journal, Chloe?" "I have been in the field since dawn," Chloe replied. "I have not seen any news." Denise let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Well, the entire financial world has seen it." The front page of the business section features a massive detailed article about the historic Black-owned Jackson family farm, striking a historic tech deal. They detailed the $180 million lithium and green energy contract your father just signed. And Chloe, there is a huge, beautiful picture of you right in the middle of the article, identifying you as the primary heir and managing director of the estate. The silence in the kitchen was profound. Chloe closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the cool wooden cabinet. Beatrice and Julian had woken up this morning as federal criminals drowning in $40 million of stolen debt. Then they had opened the newspaper and seen the farm girl they had relentlessly mocked standing at the helm of a $180 million legitimate clean energy empire. "They want your money, Chloe," Denise said, her voice filled with a fierce protective anger. "They want to trick you into signing away your newfound wealth to save them from federal prison. Julian knows that as your husband, he might be able to coerce you into signing a spousal financial power of attorney or a joint asset declaration before you find out about the federal indictment. They want to use your family land to pay off their victims and keep themselves out of a jail cell." The sheer audacity of their plan made Chloe's blood boil. For 5 years, she had endured their racial microaggressions, their classist insults, and their constant attempts to make her feel small and unworthy. They had treated her family legacy like dirt. Now they wanted to steal that very same dirt to save their own pathetic, fraudulent lives. They were literal parasites trying to latch onto a healthy host because their own corrupt ecosystem was collapsing. "Julian thinks I am stupid," Chloe said, her voice cold and steady. "He thinks because I prefer denim and work boots over imported silk that I do not understand corporate law. He thinks he can drive down here, flash a fake smile, and manipulate me into liquidating my ancestors' land to save his fake empire. Do not underestimate how dangerous a desperate man can be," Denise warned, her tone growing incredibly serious. "Julian is watching his entire life collapse in real time. He is facing the complete destruction of his social status and the very real threat of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Men like him do not lose gracefully. They lash out, they manipulate, and they will stop at nothing to survive. I need you to hire armed security for the farm immediately." "Chloe, I am serious. Do not let him anywhere near you without protection." "I will be fine, Denise," Chloe assured her, looking out the kitchen window toward the sprawling green fields. "My father has enough hands on this property to handle anyone who tries to trespass. But go ahead and prepare my legal team. I have a feeling Julian is going to try something incredibly foolish very soon." Just as Chloe spoke those words, her eyes caught a sudden movement in the distance. The long dirt road that led from the main highway to the farmhouse was usually quiet this time of day. But right now, a massive cloud of thick red dust was kicking up into the air, moving at a reckless and aggressive speed. "Someone is driving up the main road," Chloe said, squinting through the sunlight. "They are driving way too fast for a dirt path." "Stay inside, Chloe," Denise commanded over the phone. "Lock the doors." Chloe watched as the vehicle broke through the dust cloud and came into full view. It was a sleek silver Maserati covered in a thick layer of Georgia clay. The luxury sports car was completely out of place on the rugged agricultural terrain. It was struggling to navigate the deep ruts and uneven soil, but the driver was aggressively forcing it forward, ignoring the damage being done to the expensive undercarriage. "It is Julian," Chloe said, her voice devoid of any fear. "He is here." The silver Maserati tore through the open iron gates of the property, the engine roaring loudly and obnoxiously against the peaceful rural backdrop. Julian took the final turn toward the farmhouse far too fast, losing traction in the loose dirt. The car fishtailed wildly, skidding sideways across the gravel driveway. It narrowly missed, colliding with a massive green tractor parked near the barn, coming to a screeching halt just inches from the heavy steel tires. Chloe did not move from the window. She watched calmly as the driver's side door of the luxury car swung open. Julian stepped out into the mud. I was not wearing his usual immaculate tailored suit. He was dressed in a casual but expensive cashmere sweater and slacks, clearly trying to look approachable and relaxed. He looked down at his designer leather loafers, which were instantly ruined as they sank into the damp red clay of the driveway. A brief flash of sheer disgust crossed his face, but he quickly suppressed it. Julian reached back into the car and pulled something out from the passenger seat. It was a massive, extravagant bouquet of deep red roses wrapped in expensive silk ribbon. He closed the car door and took a deep breath, smoothing down his sweater. Then he looked up at the farmhouse and pasted on the most sickeningly sweet, apologetic smile Chloe had ever seen in her entire life. "He really brought flowers," Chloe murmured into the phone, a cold, hard laugh escaping her lips. "He is $40 million in debt. The feds are raiding his office, and he drove 3 hours down a dirt road with a bouquet of roses, thinking he can seduce me into handing over my family fortune. Do not let him inside the house, Chloe," Denise repeated, her voice tense with worry. "I am dispatching private security from Atlanta right now, but they will not be there for at least 2 hours. Keep your distance. Let him talk if you have to, but do not sign a single piece of paper, and do not let him isolate you. Do not worry, Denise." Chloe said, her eyes locked on her husband as he began walking toward the front porch. "Farm girls know how to handle pests. I will call you back." Chloe ended the call and slipped the phone into her back pocket. She took one last sip of her sweet tea, feeling the cool liquid soothe her dry throat. Julian Evans, the man who had allowed his mother to banish her to a hallway, the man who had silently watched his family degrade her heritage for 5 long years, was now standing on her property, holding flowers and begging for an audience. He thought he was the predator coming to trick a naive, vulnerable woman. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking straight into a trap. He had no idea that Chloe already knew everything about his crimes, his massive debts, and his impending federal indictment. Julian was stepping onto her land, believing he was holding all the cards, but the truth was he was already a dead man walking. Chloe unlatched the heavy wooden front door and pushed open the screen, stepping out onto the porch to welcome her husband to the mud. I pushed open the heavy wooden screen door and stepped out onto the wraparound porch of my family home. The wood groaned softly beneath my boots, a familiar and comforting sound that I had known since childhood. The humid Georgia air hung thick and heavy around me, carrying the scent of damp earth and approaching rain. Julian was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, looking entirely out of place in his expensive cashmere sweater and tailored slack. His designer leather loafers were already sinking deep into the wet red clay, completely ruined by the very mud he had always despised. Beatrice stood a few paces behind him, shivering in her silk blouse, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of forced affection. Julian looked up at me and flashed that practiced blinding smile he reserved for wealthy clients and gullible investors. He took a step forward, raising the massive bouquet of deep red roses toward me, as if they could magically erase 5 years of relentless emotional abuse. "Chloe, darling," he said, his voice dripping with a fake honeyed sweetness that made my stomach churn. "I am so incredibly sorry for the misunderstanding at Thanksgiving. My mother and I were just so stressed with work, and we let our frustrations get the better of us. We have been worried sick about you. Please come here and give your husband a hug so we can put all of this ugly business behind us." Beatrice took a tentative step forward, her heels sinking into the dirt. She clasped her hands together over her chest, trying to look like a desperate, grieving mother. "My beautiful daughter," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "We must stick together in times like these. Black excellence must protect Black excellence. We need to present a united front against a world that wants to see us fail. Please come back to Atlanta with us so we can be a real family again." I stood perfectly still on the elevated porch, looking down at the two of them. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost hypnotic to watch. Just 4 days ago, Beatrice had banished me to a dark hallway because my presence supposedly ruined her dinner party. Just 4 days ago, she had sat in her pristine dining room and allowed her white daughter-in-law, Brittany, to openly mock my natural hair and insult my heritage. There was no talk of Black excellence then. There was only a desperate, pathetic attempt to distance themselves from their own roots by degrading mine. I looked at the wilting roses in Julian's hands, and I felt absolutely nothing. I did not walk down the steps. I did not reach out to take the flowers. I simply looked at Julian and told him to stop lying. I told him that I knew he did not drive 3 hours down a dirt road because he missed his wife. I told Beatrix that she did not care about black excellence when she was busy worshipping a white woman who openly disrespected her own son. I told them both that their fake apologies were insulting my intelligence and that they needed to drop the act immediately before I had the farmhands physically remove them from the property. Julian's fake smile slowly vanished from his face. The charming, successful lawyer disappeared, leaving behind the desperate cornered animal he truly was. He let the expensive bouquet of roses drop from his hands, letting the bright red petals fall directly into the thick brown mud. He took another step up the porch stairs, his eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating anger. "If you want to drop the act, then fine," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "Let us drop the act and talk about reality." He reached inside his cashmere jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slapped the paper down onto the wooden railing of the porch, pointing a shaking finger at the bold text printed at the top. It was a spousal financial power of attorney. Julian glared at me, his chest heaving with barely contained panic. "You are my wife, Chloe," he said, his words sharp and commanding. "We are legally married in the state of Georgia. Under state law, any major financial windfall acquired during our marriage is considered a joint marital asset. Half of your assets belong to me." He took another step closer, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He told me that I was going to sign that document right now. He told me that I was going to grant him full executive control over the $180 million lithium contract my father had just signed. He demanded that I inject massive liquidity into his wealth management firm immediately. If I refused, he threatened to drag me through the most vicious, prolonged divorce in the history of the state. He promised to tie up my family farm in endless litigation, freezing the government contract and bankrupting my parents with legal fees until the green energy conglomerate walked away from the deal entirely. I listened to his frantic, desperate threats, and I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. He was sweating profusely, his perfectly styled hair now sticking to his forehead in the humid air. He was a man drowning in $40 million of stolen Ponzi scheme debt, completely unaware that his wife already knew every single detail of his impending federal indictment. He thought he held the ultimate leverage over my life. He thought the threat of a messy divorce would bring me to my knees. I looked at the silver pen he was holding out to me. I reached out and took the pen from his trembling hand. I clicked the top of the pen, letting the sharp sound echo in the quiet country air. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "You want to talk about marital law, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You want to stand on my porch and threaten my family with asset division and litigation? Let us talk about marital law. Let us talk about exactly what you signed 5 years ago." I turned my back on him and walked down the steps, ignoring his confused demands to come back. I walked past his ruined shoes and the trampled roses, heading straight toward my father's large wooden barn. I knew Julian and Beatrice would follow me. They were too desperate for the money to leave without a signature. I heard their heavy, clumsy footsteps trailing behind me as we entered the cool, dark interior of the barn. The smell of aged pine and motor oil filled the air. At the back of the barn, hidden behind a row of heavy tools, sat my father's massive iron safe. My father was a generational farmer, but he was also a man who understood the ruthless nature of corporate greed. When Julian and I first announced our engagement 5 years ago, my father had seen right through Julian's polished exterior. He had seen the deep-seated arrogance and the hidden contempt Julian held for our rural way of life. My father had insisted on protecting our ancestral land before allowing the marriage to proceed. 5 years ago, Julian had been so incredibly arrogant. He had viewed my family farm as a worthless piece of dirt, completely devoid of any real financial value. He was so incredibly proud of his own elite trust fund and his prestigious firm that he wanted to ensure I could never touch his wealth in the event of a divorce. So when my father presented him with a highly customized prenuptial agreement, Julian had eagerly signed it without a second thought. He had barely even bothered to read the specific clauses my father had carefully drafted alongside our family attorneys. I entered the combination into the iron safe, pulling down the heavy metal lever. The door swung open with a smooth mechanical click. I reached inside and pulled out a pristine, heavily notarized folder. I turned around and walked back out of the barn, carrying the folder in my hands. Julian and Beatrice were waiting by the silver Maserati, looking impatient and agitated. I walked right up to the front of his luxury car and tossed the folder directly onto the hood. It landed with a heavy thud right in front of Julian's eyes. Julian stared at the folder for a moment before hesitantly reaching out to open it. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It was the original prenuptial agreement we had signed half a decade ago. I had taken the liberty of highlighting the most important clauses in bright yellow ink so he would not miss them. I told him to read the highlighted sections out loud. I wanted to hear him say the words that would officially seal his fate and destroy his last remaining hope of avoiding federal prison. Julian remained silent, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. The legal language was absolutely ironclad. The agreement explicitly stated that Julian Evans waived all present and future rights to the Jackson ancestral land. It stated that he permanently forfeited any claim to all natural resources, minerals, water rights, and any future profits derived from the property, regardless of when those assets were discovered or monetized. He had signed away his right to the $180 million before the lithium was ever even found. He had traded his rights to a multi-million-dollar green energy empire just to protect a fraudulent Ponzi scheme trust fund that was currently being seized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I watched as the color completely drained from Julian's face. His tan skin turned a sickly shade of pale gray. His hands began to shake so violently that the thick legal document rattled in his grip. The reality of the situation crashed over him like a physical blow. He was trapped. He had absolutely no legal claim to my wealth. He could not freeze my assets. He could not drag the farm into a messy divorce settlement. His only lifeline, his only way to pay back the $40 million he had stolen from his elderly investors was gone. He was going to federal prison, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Beatrice sensed the massive shift in the atmosphere. She pushed past Julian, snatching the document from his hands to read it for herself. She was not a lawyer, but even she could understand the plain, simple English of the forfeit clause. She let out a loud, horrified gasp, dropping the paper back onto the hood of the car. She looked at me, her eyes wide, with a manic, terrifying desperation. She realized that their entire world was collapsing, and that I was standing completely outside the blast radius, untouched and protected by the very father she had mocked. Beatrice lost whatever tiny fraction of composure she had left. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking and breaking in the humid air. She pointed an accusing finger at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You planned this," she shrieked, her entire body trembling with rage. "You evil, vindictive farm girl. You orchestrated this entire thing just to destroy our family because you were jealous of our success. You set us up to fail so you could sit back and watch us lose everything." I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I simply took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches from her panicked face. I leaned in close, letting the silence stretch out for a long, terrifying moment. I looked directly into her wide, fearful eyes, and I smiled. I whispered my words slow and calculated, ensuring that both she and Julian heard every single syllable perfectly. I told her that I did not orchestrate the massive FBI raid on her fraudulent Ponzi scheme. I told her that I had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that federal agents were currently tearing apart Julian's office, looking for the $40 million they had stolen from innocent people. But I leaned in even closer, keeping my voice at a low, dangerous whisper. I told them that I did know exactly who had drained the last $5 million from their firm accounts right before the FBI arrived. I told them that I knew exactly who had taken their last remaining lifeline and wired it to an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands, leaving Julian and Beatrice completely broke and entirely alone to take the fall for the entire federal indictment. Julian and Beatrice froze, their entire bodies, locking into a state of absolute paralyzed horror. The screaming stopped. The threats stopped. The only sound left in the Georgia heat was the rustling of the pine trees and the crushing, devastating silence of their impending doom. The heavy silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, like the summer air before a massive thunderstorm. Julian stood completely paralyzed, his eyes wide and vacant as my words slowly penetrated his thick skull. The arrogant financial lawyer who had just threatened to destroy my life was now struggling to remember how to breathe. Beside him, Beatrice looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her mouth hung open, But no sound came out. The pristine image of the Evans family, the facade of elite Atlanta society they had so carefully curated, was crumbling into dust right here in the red clay of my family farm. I took a step back, putting some distance between myself and their desperation. For 5 years, I had watched Beatrice Perro, her other daughter-in-law, around like a trophy. Brittany was the shining star of the Evans family simply because she came from a wealthy white family with a historic last name. Beatrice had practically worshipped the ground. Brittany walked on constantly praising her refined etiquette and her expensive taste. Beatrice believed that having Brittany in the family legitimized them, somehow erasing their own insecurities about their newly acquired wealth. Whenever Brittany made a snide, passive-aggressive comment about my hair or my clothes or my rural upbringing, Beatrice would simply smile and nod along, validating the disrespect. Julian finally managed to find his voice. It came out as a weak, pathetic rasp. "What are you talking about, Chloe?" he asked, his hands trembling so badly he had to lean against the hood of his ruined Maserati just to stay upright. "Who took the money?" I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with absolute disgust. "I told you, Julian," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. "My lawyers have been working around the clock since this morning. When Denise informed me about the federal raid on your firm, she also deployed a team of forensic accountants and private investigators to look into the frozen assets. We knew you would come down here looking for a bailout, so we needed to know exactly how deep your debt truly went." I paused, letting him hang on every word. "The investigators found something highly irregular in the transaction logs from late last night. Just hours before the Federal Bureau of Investigation kicked down the glass doors of your beautiful downtown office, a massive wire transfer was executed. Someone with top-tier executive clearance bypassed the standard security protocols and liquidated the very last of your firm's remaining cash reserves. Exactly $5 million was siphoned out of the primary holding accounts and routed through a complex series of shell companies before landing in an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Beatrix shook her head violently, her designer wig shifting slightly out of place. "No," she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. "That is impossible. The banks would have flagged a transfer that large. Darren is the only other person besides Julian who has the authorization to move those kinds of funds. My Darren would never steal from his own brother." I looked at Beatrice and felt a cold smile touched my lips. "You are absolutely right, Beatrice. Darren did have the authorization, and Darren knew exactly what he was doing. But Darren has never been the mastermind in his marriage, has he? Darren has always done exactly what his precious, perfect wife told him to do." The realization hit Julian first. His eyes darted back and forth as he mentally reviewed the events of the past 24 hours. He remembered who had stayed late at the office. He remembered who had insisted on managing the internal audits last week. "No," Julian whispered, shaking his head. "Brittany would not do that. Her family has hundreds of millions in trusts. She does not need our money. She does not need your money." Julie and I agreed, but she absolutely needs to protect her own family name from the disgrace of a federal Ponzi scheme indictment. "You really thought Brittany respected you? You thought her old money family actually accepted you into their exclusive country club world. They tolerated you because your firm was generating cash. But Brittany is not stupid. She saw the writing on the wall. She saw the returns slowing down and she noticed the discrepancies in your financial reports long before the feds did." I took a step closer to the car, making sure they heard every single detail of their impending ruin. Brittany and Darren knew the collapse was coming. They knew the federal agents were building a case, so Brittany orchestrated a brilliant exit strategy. She convinced Darren to quietly transfer all the primary liability documents into your name, Julian. She made sure your signature was on every single fraudulent land deed and every fake investor portfolio. And then last night, while you were busy trying to figure out how to cover your tracks, they packed their bags, took the last $5 million of your stolen money, and bought themselves a golden parachute. "They framed you, Julian," I said, letting the absolute truth sink in. "Darren and Brittany set you and your mother up to take the fall for the entire $40 million fraud. They are probably sitting on a private beach right now, drinking champagne and laughing at how incredibly easy it was to leave you holding the bag." Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed across the empty fields of the farm. She slammed her hands down hard onto the hood of the Maserati, the heavy thud ringing out in the humid air. "You are lying," she shrieked, spittle flying from her lips. Her eyes were wild and unfocused. Brittany comes from a respectable family. Brittany has class and dignity. She would never betray us like this. You are just a jealous, bitter farm girl trying to tear our beautiful family apart with your disgusting lies. You are making all of this up because you want to see us suffer. I did not react to her screaming. I simply reached into the front pocket of my denim jeans and pulled out a small silver flash. I held it up in the sunlight, letting the metal catch the glare. I did not make up the wire transfer receipts. Beatrice, I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative tone that commanded absolute silence. I did not make up the flight logs, showing that Brittany and Darren boarded a private charter out of Atlanta at 3:00 inches the morning. And I certainly did not make up the fact that your golden daughter-in-law deliberately threw your son to the federal wolves to save her own skin. I tossed the flash drive. It landed right next to the prenuptial agreement on the hood of the car. Everything you need to prove my words is right there on that drive, I told them. The transaction ID is the offshore routing numbers and the flight manifest. You can give it to your criminal defense attorney, assuming you can still afford to hire one, though I doubt it will do you much good against a massive federal indictment. Julian stared at the flash drive like it was a venomous snake. He looked completely defeated. The arrogant, powerful lawyer who had driven down here to threaten and manipulate me was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man who had just realized that his entire life was a lie. He had lost his firm. He had lost his freedom. And he had been profoundly betrayed by his own flesh and blood. And the only person who could have possibly saved him, the wife he had relentlessly abused and discarded, was now standing above him, holding all the power. I looked past them toward the main barn where my father had been quietly watching the entire confrontation unfold. I raised my hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod. Within seconds, the heavy wooden doors of the barn slid open. 4 of our most experienced farmhands walked out. Stepping into the afternoon sun, these were large, muscular men who spent their days hauling heavy equipment and wrangling livestock. They wore thick work boots and carried long wooden pitchforks resting casually over their shoulders. They did not say a word as they began walking down the dirt driveway toward the silver Maserati. Julian looked up and saw the men approaching. His survival instinct finally kicked in, overriding his shock. He grabbed the folder containing our prenuptial agreement and snatched the silver flash drive off the hood of his car. He scrambled to open the driver's side door, his muddy loafers slipping awkwardly against the metal frame. "Get in the car, Mom," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Get in the car right now." Beatrice was still hyperventilating her hands, clutching her chest as she stared at me with a mixture of terror and absolute hatred. She looked at the approaching farmhands and then scrambled toward the passenger side of the vehicle, ruining her expensive silk blouse as she slid against the dirty exterior of the car. Before Julian could close his door, I walked right up to the window and placed my hands on the glass. I looked down at the man I had once promised to spend the rest of my life with. "Do not ever come back to my property, Julian," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "Do not call my phone. Do not text me. You and your family made it very clear that I do not belong at your table. Now I am making it very clear that you do not belong on my land. Have a safe drive back to Atlanta. I hear the federal holding cells are incredibly uncomfortable this time of year." I stepped back and watched as Julian frantically slammed the door shut and started the engine. The Maserati roared to life, the tires spinning wildly in the thick red mud. He threw the car into reverse, nearly backing into one of the wooden fence posts before violently shifting into drive. The luxury vehicle tore down the dirt road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as it fled from the property, leaving deep, ugly ruts in the soil. I stood in the driveway and watched the dust settle. The farmhands walked up beside me, leaning on their pitchforks. One of them, an older man named Mark, who had worked for my family since I was a little girl, let out a low whistle. "Well, Miss Chloe," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "that is one pest we will not have to worry about spraying for again." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over my tired body. "You are right about that, Mark," I said, turning to face the sprawling green fields. "They are gone, and they are never coming back." I walked back up the porch steps and retrieved my glass of sweet tea. The ice had melted, watering down the dark liquid, but I drank it anyway. The sweet taste grounded me, reminding me of the simple, honest life I had fought so hard to reclaim. I sat down in one of the wooden rocking chairs and looked out over the land. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the tops of the pine trees. For the first time in 5 years, I felt completely entirely free. I thought about the future. I thought about the $180 million green energy contract and the incredible scientific facility my family was going to build on the southern ridge. I thought about how much good we could do for our local community, providing jobs and educational scholarships for young Black students who wanted to study agriculture and environmental science. I was going to use my wealth to build something lasting and meaningful, not squander it on superficial country club memberships and fake societal status. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, intending to finally call Denise back and give her the good news. I wanted to tell her that the Evans family had been successfully eradicated from the premises and that we could begin drafting the official divorce papers immediately. But as I unlocked the screen, a breaking news alert flashed across the top of my display. The notification banner bore the logo of a major Atlanta news network, and the headline instantly made my blood run ice cold. I tapped the alert, opening the live news feed. The screen buffered for a moment, before loading a live video broadcast originating from a lavish hotel ballroom in downtown Atlanta. The room was packed with journalist news cameras and anxious investors. Standing at a polished wooden podium, looking disheveled but desperate, was Julian. He must have driven straight from the farm to the hotel, completely ignoring the speed limits. Beatrice was standing right behind him, wearing a new wig and a forced, terrifying smile. My heart hammered against my ribs as I turned up the volume on my phone. Julian's voice echoed through the small speaker, sounding strained but heavily practiced. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Julian announced, gripping the edges of the podium. "We know there have been some concerning rumors circulating today regarding our firm and a misunderstanding with federal regulators. We are here to assure our investors that your assets are completely secure. In fact, our firm is stronger than ever." He paused, looking directly into the flashing cameras. He was sweating profusely, but he pushed forward with his desperate lie. "I am proud to officially announce that our firm has entered into a strategic merger with Jackson Green Energy. My brilliant wife, Chloe Jackson, who recently secured a historic $180 million government contract, is injecting massive capital into our operations. This merger will completely revolutionize our portfolio and guarantee unprecedented returns for all of our loyal clients." I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of his delusion. Julian was publicly lying to local and national news networks. He was illegally using my name, my family farm, and my federal contract to calm his panicked investors and stop the bank from seizing his remaining assets. He was trying to buy himself time, hoping that the public announcement would force me into a corner and compel me to bail him out to avoid a media scandal. He had severely miscalculated. He thought I would shrink away from the public spotlight out of embarrassment. He thought the farm girl would be too intimidated by the Atlanta press to fight back. He had no idea that he had just given me the perfect stage to absolutely destroy him. I stood up from the rocking chair, gripping the phone tightly in my hand. I walked back into the farmhouse, moving with a swift, deadly purpose. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing the agricultural supply logs. He looked up, seeing the fierce, unapologetic fire blazing in my eyes. I placed the phone on the table so he could see the live broadcast of Julian lying to the world. I looked at my father, the man who had taught me how to cultivate life and how to ruthlessly eliminate weeds that threatened the crop. "Fire up the jet, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "We are going to Atlanta." The flight from our rural airstrip to Atlanta took less than an hour, but it felt like a culmination of a lifetime. My father sat across from me in the plush leather seat of the charter jet, reviewing the final legal documents my attorney Denise had sent over a secure connection. Looking out the small oval window, I watched the rolling green fields of Georgia give way to the sprawling concrete and glass infrastructure of the city. Atlanta was a place that had always demanded I shrink myself to fit into its high society molds. It was a city where the Evans family had reigned supreme, using their old money connections and polished facades to look down on people who worked with their hands. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority. But today, I was not returning as the quiet, obedient wife who ate Thanksgiving dinner in a hallway. I was returning as the primary shareholder of a $180 million energy empire and the absolute architect of their impending destruction. Denise was waiting for us on the tarmac when the jet touched down. She was flanked by 3 of the most intimidating corporate litigators I had ever seen, along with 2 massive armed security guards who looked like they were carved out of solid granite. Denise handed me a fresh stack of injunctions and cease and desist orders as we climbed into the back of a waiting black SUV. She explained that Julian and Beatrice had spared no expense in organizing this press conference. They had rented out the grand ballroom of the most luxurious hotel in downtown Atlanta. They had invited every major financial reporter, local news anchor, and panicked investor they could find. Their goal was to create a media spectacle so large and so convincing that it would artificially inflate their collapsing credit rating and stop the federal receivership from seizing their remaining properties before the end of the business day. Julian was banking on the idea that public pressure and the fear of a messy media scandal would force me into silence. The drive to the hotel was tense but focused. Denise briefed the security team on their exact positions, while my father simply held my hand, his strong, calloused fingers, providing a silent reminder of the unbreakable foundation I came from. When we pulled up to the loading dock of the hotel, the security guards moved with military precision. They escorted us through the service corridors, completely bypassing the media circus gathered in the main lobby. We navigated the quiet carpeted hallways until we stood directly behind the massive, heavy mahogany doors that led into the grand ballroom. Through the thick wood, I could hear the muffled sound of Julian's voice echoing through the sound system. Denise nodded to the guards, and they carefully cracked the door open just a few inches, allowing us to see and hear everything happening inside without being detected. The grand ballroom was a sea of flashing camera lights and restless murmuring. Hundreds of folding chairs were packed with journalists holding microphones and investors clutching their financial portfolios with white knuckles. At the very front of the room stood a raised stage adorned with expensive floral arrangements and a sleek wooden podium. Julian stood behind the microphone wearing his finest Italian suit, but the confident aura he usually projected was completely shattered. He was sweating profusely under the bright stage lights, constantly pulling a linen handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his forehead. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. Standing just behind him was Beatrice, wearing an elegant emerald green dress and a forced smile that looked more like a grimace of physical pain. To her right sat Brittany and Darren, the very two people who had embezzled the last $5 million from the firm. They had clearly returned from their aborted escape attempt, realizing that running would only guarantee federal prison. They were all standing there together, playing the role of a united, prosperous family. Julian cleared his throat and leaned closer to the microphone. His voice trembled slightly, but he forced a tone of arrogant reassurance. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, and to our valued investors, thank you for your patience today," Julian said, scanning the crowd with desperate eyes. "We know there have been completely unfounded rumors circulating this morning regarding the financial stability of our firm and a massive misunderstanding with federal regulators. I am standing here today to promise you that the Evans family legacy remains stronger and more secure than ever before." A reporter in the second row raised a hand and shouted a question about the missing $40 million. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Beatrice for a brief second before he returned to his script. "There is no missing money." Julian lied straight through his teeth, his voice echoing across the ballroom. "The federal inquiry was a simple clerical error regarding a delayed tax filing. In fact, we have called you here today to announce an unprecedented expansion of our corporate portfolio. Our firm has officially entered into an exclusive strategic merger with Jackson Green Energy." The room erupted into loud whispers and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Reporters began frantically typing on their laptops. Julian raised his hands to quiet the crowd, his fake smile stretching wider across his sweating face. "My brilliant and beautiful wife, Chloe Jackson, who recently secured a historic $180 million federal contract, is injecting massive capital directly into our daily operations." Julian continued painting a picture of marital bliss and financial salvation. "This strategic merger will not only clear any temporary liquidity issues we face, but it will completely revolutionize our investment portfolio. My wife and I are committed to moving forward together to guarantee unparalleled returns for every single one of our loyal clients." I stood behind the mahogany doors, listening to the sheer delusional audacity of his words. He was committing textbook federal securities fraud on live television. He was using my name, my family land, and my government contract to steal more time and money from the very people he had already defrauded. He was doubling down on his lies, believing that if he trapped me in the public spotlight, I would be too intimidated to humiliate him. He still thought of me as the quiet farm girl who would rather hide in a hallway than cause a scene. I looked at Denise and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The two armed security guards stepped forward and grabbed the brass handles of the heavy mahogany doors. With one synchronized powerful motion, they pushed the doors open. The heavy wood banged loudly against the interior walls of the ballroom, sending a shockwave of sound echoing over the heads of the crowd. Every single person in the room turned around simultaneously. The flashing camera lights shifted their focus from the stage to the back of the room. The restless murmuring of the journalists and investors instantly died down, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. I walked into the ballroom. I was not wearing the uncomfortable, restrictive designer dresses that Beatrice used to force upon me. I wore a sharply tailored emerald green pantsuit that matched the color of my ancestral land and comfortable leather boots that echoed firmly against the hardwood floor. Denise walked on my right, holding a thick leather briefcase filled with devastating legal evidence. My father walked on my left, a towering figure of quiet strength. The three elite corporate litigators followed closely behind us, while the two armed security guards cleared a path straight down the center aisle. The atmosphere in this room shifted so violently, it was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. Reporters scrambled to get out of our way, their eyes wide with recognition as they compared my face to the morning edition of the Wall Street Journal. Investors parted like the Red Sea, watching our procession with a mixture of absolute confusion and rising panic. Up on the stage, the color completely drained from Julian's face. He stopped mid-sentence, hanging open in a silent scream of terror. The linen handkerchief slipped from his trembling fingers and drifted slowly to the floor, behind him. Beatrice let out a short, high-pitched gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Darren and Brittany froze their eyes, darting toward the side exits, clearly calculating if they had enough time to make a run for it. I did not break eye contact with Julian as I marched down the center aisle. The heavy silence in the room was only broken by the rhythmic clicking of camera shutters, capturing every second of his impending ruin. I reached the front row of folding chairs and walked straight up the short flight of stairs leading onto the stage. My security guards positioned themselves at the base of the stairs, ensuring no one could interfere. Denise and my legal team fanned out behind me, forming an impenetrable wall of corporate authority. Julian stumbled backward away from the podium, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking completely. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the farm." I did not look at him. I walked directly to the wooden podium, resting my hands on either side of the microphone. I looked out over the sea of journalists, reporters, and desperate investors. Their faces were illuminated by the harsh glare of the stage lights, waiting with bated breath for the heir of the Jackson Energy empire to speak. The entire state of Georgia was watching this broadcast live. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring my voice was crystal clear. "I am Chloe Jackson," I announced my voice, projecting an absolute unwavering authority that echoed through the massive ballroom. "And absolutely everything my soon-to-be ex-husband just said to you is a federal crime." The ballroom exploded into absolute chaos. Dozens of reporters jumped out of their seats, shouting questions over each other. Investors began screaming, demanding to know what was happening to their money. Camera flashes turned the room into a blinding strobe light of panic and confusion. I raised my hand, calling for silence. The sheer command in my posture forced the room to quiet down once again, hanging desperately on my next words. "There is no strategic merger between Jackson Green Energy and the Evans family firm," I stated coldly, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. "I have not authorized a single penny of my family wealth to be injected into their operations. Furthermore, Julian Evans has absolutely no legal claim to my assets. We signed a binding prenuptial agreement 5 years ago in which he voluntarily surrendered all rights to the land he is currently trying to use as collateral. Julian is standing before you today, lying to the public, lying to the press, and lying to the federal government in a desperate attempt to cover up a $40 million Ponzi scheme that was raided by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." At 8 this morning, pandemonium struck the room. Investors began rushing toward the stage, screaming obscenities at Julian and demanding their life savings back. Security guards had to physically restrain several elderly victims who were trying to climb the stairs to attack Beatrice. The journalists were frantic, reporting live on the air that the Evans family legacy had just been exposed as a massive criminal fraud by their own daughter-in-law. Julian was hyperventilating, backing himself into the floral arrangements at the rear of the stage. He was completely trapped, cornered by his own lies and the overwhelming presence of my legal team. Beatrice was openly sobbing, her perfectly styled hair now a chaotic mess, as she realized her high society life was permanently over. But just as Denise stepped forward to present the physical copies of the federal injunctions to the press, the situation took a sudden toxic turn. Brittany, the beloved white sister-in-law, who had embezzled $5 million and tried to frame her own family, leaped up from her chair in the front row. She threw herself toward the edge of the stage, bursting into a display of loud, hysterical tears. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a calculated theatrical performance designed entirely to shift the narrative and paint me as the aggressor. "Why are you doing this?" Chloe Brittany screamed, her voice cracking with manufactured devastation. She covered her face with her hands, letting her blonde hair fall in messy strands across her shoulders, playing the role of the terrified, innocent victim to absolute perfection. "Why are you trying to destroy a good, honest family just because you felt left out at a dinner party?" The entire room suddenly went quiet again. The reporters lowered their notepads and turned their camera lenses away from the sweating, terrified Julian and pointed them directly at me. Brittany continued her hysterical sobs, sobbing, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You are just an angry, bitter woman trying to ruin us because you are jealous," Brittany wailed, making sure her tears caught the bright lights of the television cameras. "We accepted you into our home, and you are doing this to us over a minor disagreement. You are acting completely unhinged, Chloe. Please stop this aggressive behavior before someone gets hurt." The silence in the room was thick with racial tension. Brittany was playing her final, most desperate card. She was using her tears and her fragile white woman persona to invoke the absolute worst stereotypes imaginable. She wanted the media to look at me standing at the podium radiating power and control, and see nothing but an angry black woman throwing a vindictive tantrum over a family squabble. She wanted the investors to doubt my words, to view my calculated legal strike as an emotional, irrational outburst. She was trying to trap me in a societal trope, hoping that if she cried hard enough, the world would naturally rush to protect her and dismiss my facts as the ramblings of a scorned, bitter wife. Julian, seeing a brief glimmer of hope in the shifting atmosphere, quickly moved to stand behind Brittany, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, playing the role of the protective family man. The reporters stood with their pens hovering over their notepads, waiting to see how I would react. They were waiting to see if I would raise my voice, if I would lash out, if I would give them the exact angry stereotype that Brittany was desperately trying to provoke. I stood at the podium looking down at the woman who had mocked my natural hair just 4 days ago. I looked at the fake tears streaming down her pale cheeks and the calculating malicious glint in her eyes. She thought she had outsmarted me. She thought her tears were a universal shield that could deflect federal evidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my posture. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute quiet power of a woman who held the truth, and $180 million in her pocket. I leaned back into the microphone, ready to show Brittany and the entire world exactly how a farm girl handles a parasite who tries to play the victim. Brittany continued to sob, her face buried in her hands as the cameras captured her carefully orchestrated performance. She was banking on the historical weight of her tears to instantly villainize me. Julian stood firmly behind her, his hand rubbing her shoulder, playing the noble defender of his fragile sister-in-law. The reporters leaned in closer, their microphones thrust toward the podium, waiting for the angry outburst they had been conditioned to expect. The entire ballroom held its breath, watching the wealthy white woman weep, while the black woman from the farm stood above her. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the silence stretch out, allowing her fake sobs to echo through the massive room until they began to sound hollow and performative. I looked down at Brittany with a terrifying composure, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Let us talk about destroying families, Brittany," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "Let us talk about who is actually trying to ruin whom." I did not look at the reporters. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Brittany and Darren. Denise stepped forward and placed a small silver flash drive onto the podium right next to the microphone. Julian stared at the drive, his brow furrowed in confusion. He thought this was a financial dispute. He thought I was here to argue about land deeds and corporate restructuring. He had absolutely no idea that the drive contained the very weapon that would incinerate his entire existence. I picked up the flash drive and walked over to the laptop that Julian's team had set up to display their fraudulent merger graphics. The massive projector screen behind the stage was currently displaying the fake logos of our supposedly merged companies. I plugged the drive into the side of the laptop. The screen flickered for a moment, casting a bright blue light over the sweating faces of the Evans family. Beatrice was glaring at me, her chest heaving with indignation. She still believed that Brittany's tears were going to save them. She still believed that her precious daughter-in-law was the ultimate shield against my attacks. She was about to learn that the shield she worshipped was actually the blade that had already severed her throat. The projector hummed loudly as the video file loaded. It was not a spreadsheet or a banking document. It was high-definition security footage taken directly from the executive suites of the Evans family wealth management firm. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 2:0 the morning. The date was exactly 24 hours ago. The ballroom went deadly quiet as the video began to play with crystal-clear audio piped directly through the hotel sound system. The footage showed the interior of Julian's lavish corner office. The heavy oak doors were closed, and the room was illuminated only by the glow of the desk lamps. Darren and Brittany were the only two people in the room. They were not working on legal defense strategies or preparing to face the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were laughing hysterically. Darren was sitting at Julian's computer, frantically typing on the keyboard while Brittany leaned over his shoulder, holding a glass of expensive bourbon. Her face was contorted with a malicious, greedy joy that completely contradicted the fragile, weeping victim she was currently pretending to be. The audio picked up every single word they said with terrifying clarity. "Wire the last $5 million to the Caymans," Darren Brittany said, her voice echoing loudly through the silent ballroom. "Make sure the routing numbers bypass the primary holding accounts. We need this money untraceable before the sun comes up." Darren laughed nervously, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "What about Julian and my mother?" he asked, his voice laced with a cowardly hesitation. "They are going to walk into the office tomorrow and face the feds completely blind." Brittany took a sip of her bourbon and let out a vicious, mocking laugh. "Let Julian and your snobby mother rot in federal prison," she said, her words dripping with absolute contempt for the family that had worshipped her. "They are too stupid to notice the missing funds until the feds kick down their door. Your mother is so obsessed with my family name and my skin color that she would never suspect me of taking every last dime she has. Let them take the fall for the entire Ponzi scheme. Darren, we are leaving." The video continued to play mercilessly, exposing every single layer of their betrayal. Brittany was seen on the massive projector screen leaning down and pressing a button on Julian's desk, ensuring that the final wire transfer was authorized under Julian's own digital signature. She was actively framing her brother-in-law for the embezzlement of the final $5 million, leaving him to face the wrath of the investors and the federal government alone. The audacity of her actions played out in stark high definition for every single news network to broadcast live across the country. The investors sitting in the folding chairs stared at the screen in absolute horror, realizing that the very people who had promised to protect their life savings were currently watching the exact moment those savings were permanently stolen. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, their cameras zooming in on the projector screen and then panning rapidly to capture the real-time reactions of the Evans family on the stage. I stood perfectly still at the podium, watching the absolute destruction of their carefully curated lies. I looked over at Beatrice, the arrogant matriarch who had spent years degrading me, who had forced me to eat in hallways and mocked my agricultural heritage, was now experiencing a psychological collapse of epic proportions. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, glued to the massive screen above her. The emerald green dress she wore seemed to hang loosely on her suddenly fragile frame. She was listening to the beloved white daughter-in-law she had placed on a pedestal, openly calling her a snobby, stupid woman who deserved to rot in a federal cell. All those years of Beatrice bending over backward to accommodate Brittany, all those years of allowing Brittany to disrespect me in the name of elevating the family status, had culminated in this exact moment. Beatrice had invited a parasite into her home because she liked the way the parasite looked, and now that parasite had completely devoured her from the inside out. Julian was trembling violently. He slowly turned his head to look at his brother Darren. The hand that had been comfortingly resting on Brittany's shoulder just moments ago now fell limply to his side. Julian had driven down to my farm and threatened to destroy my life, assuming I was his biggest enemy. He had spent his entire morning trying to figure out how to manipulate me into saving him from the Ponzi scheme fallout. He had never once suspected that the architects of his immediate doom were sitting right next to him at the dinner table. The realization that his own brother had framed him for the final wire transfer, breaking the last of the firm's liquidity and leaving him as the sole target for the FBI investigation, broke whatever remained of Julian's sanity. The video ended with Brittany tossing back the rest of her bourbon and pulling Darren toward the office door, leaving Julian's computer logged in and displaying the empty account balances. The projector screen faded to a solid black, plunging the stage into a stark, contrasting silence. The entire ballroom let out a collective, synchronized gasp. The quiet was heavy thick, with the impending explosion of raw, unfiltered human emotion. The reporters did not even ask questions. They simply kept their cameras rolling, knowing that they were witnessing the total catastrophic implosion of one of Atlanta's most prominent elite families. I pulled the flash drive from the laptop and slipped it quietly back into the pocket of my green suit. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply stepped back from the podium, allowing the natural consequences of their actions to take the absolute center stage. Brittany's fake tears had completely vanished. The fragile, weeping victim persona she had so masterfully executed just 3 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a stark, terrified panic. She backed away from the edge of the stage, her designer heels clicking frantically against the wooden floorboards. She looked at the reporters and then at the furious faces of the investors who were beginning to stand up from their chairs. She knew there was no escaping the visual evidence. She had been caught on tape committing federal wire fraud and framing her own family. Beatrice let out a sound that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was not a scream. It was a guttural, primal roar of absolute heartbreak and furious rage. The woman who had spent her entire life maintaining perfect posture and polite societal smiles completely snapped. Beatrice lunged across the stage, her hands outstretched like claws. She threw herself directly at Brittany, tackling the younger woman to the floor of the stage. The two women went down in a tangle of expensive fabrics and flailing limbs. Beatrice was screaming, hysterically, tearing at Brittany's blonde hair and screaming about betrayal and stolen money. Brittany shrieked, trying to push the older woman off her, but Beatrice was fueled by the sheer adrenaline of total financial and social ruin. Darren, seeing his wife being attacked by his own mother, panicked completely. He did not try to break up the fight. He did not try to apologize to his brother. Darren turned his back on his family and made a desperate, cowardly dash toward the side exit of the ballroom. He leaped off the side of the stage, his arms pumping as he sprinted toward the heavy velvet curtains that covered the service doors. But he did not make it. The reporters and camera crews, who had been eagerly documenting the chaos, immediately swarmed the aisle, blocking his path. They shoved microphones into his face, blinding him with camera flashes, and demanding to know where the $5 million was hidden. Darren shoved a cameraman trying to break through the human wall, but the investors who had lost their retirement funds joined the blockade. Several large, angry men grabbed Darren by the shoulders and shoved him roughly back toward the stage, demanding their money back. Julian was completely unhinged. He watched his brother try to run, and something inside him finally shattered. The polished financial lawyer, the man who had always cared so deeply about optics and control, let out a furious scream and launched himself off the stage. Julian tackled his own brother into the front row of folding chairs, sending metal and plastic crashing to the ground. The two brothers began throwing violent, desperate punches at each other, rolling around on the carpeted floor of the ballroom right in front of the local and national news cameras. It was a scene of absolute, unrestrained chaos. The perfect elite Evans family, the people who had mocked my rural upbringing and called my family dirty peasants, were now physically brawling with each other on the floor of a hotel ballroom. Beatrice was still on the stage screaming and slapping at Brittany, who was desperately trying to crawl away toward the podium. Julian and Darren were destroying the front row of seating, their expensive suits ripping as they traded blows fueled by betrayal and the looming threat of federal prison. The security guards stationed at the doors did not intervene immediately. The investors were shouting, calling for the police to lock all the doors so none of the Evans family members could escape. The journalists were capturing every single humiliating second, broadcasting the violent collapse of the Ponzi scheme to millions of viewers across the country. I stood near the back of the stage, completely removed from the physical violence taking place just feet away from me. Denise and my elite legal team stood forming a protective barrier, ensuring that none of the chaos reached my position. I watched the Evans family destroy themselves with a cold clinical detachment. They had spent years trying to break my spirit, trying to make me feel small and insignificant. They had tried to steal the legacy of my ancestors to save their own corrupt empire. Now they were tearing each other to pieces, fighting over the scraps of a fraudulent life they could no longer maintain. I looked down at Beatrice, who was sobbing hysterically, as hotel security finally rushed the stage to pull her away from a bruised and disheveled Brittany. I looked at Julian, whose face was bleeding from a punch his own brother had just delivered. They had lost everything. Their money, their status, their freedom, and their family bonds were all completely gone. They had been eradicated by the truth they had tried so hard to bury. The wailing of approaching sirens grew louder, piercing through the chaotic shouting inside the grand ballroom. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the towering glass windows of the hotel, casting an eerie shifting glow over the violent scene unfolding before me. Julian had managed to pin Darren to the floor, his hands gripping his brother's collar as he screamed about the federal indictment. Julian's voice was broken, completely devoid of the arrogant courtroom confidence he used to wear like armor. He was sobbing as he struck his brother, demanding to know how Darren could possibly leave him to rot in a federal holding cell. Darren fought back weakly, his nose bleeding onto the expensive hotel carpet, his eyes wide with the terror of a coward who had finally been caught. Up on the stage, security personnel were struggling to keep Beatrice restrained. The older woman had lost her designer shoes in the scuffle, and her expensive emerald dress was torn at the shoulder. She was thrashing wildly against the guards, spitting venomous curses at Brittany. Brittany was huddled near the wooden podium, crying genuine tears of fear now that her calculated escape plan had been brutally exposed to the world. The white woman, who had relied so heavily on her old money status to shield her from consequences, was now sitting on the floor of a stage, surrounded by hostile cameras, her reputation permanently destroyed by her own recorded words. The investors who had gathered for the press conference were not showing any mercy. They formed a tight circle around the fighting brothers, their faces twisted in rage. These were people who had trusted the Evans family with their retirement funds, their children's college savings, and their generational wealth. Watching the two men who had orchestrated the massive Ponzi scheme physically attacking each other over the last stolen $5 million only fueled the investors' fury. They shouted for the police to hurry, demanding that no one from the Evans family be allowed to leave the premises. I watched the entire spectacle, feeling the solid presence of my father standing beside me. He did not speak, but the firm grip of his hand conveyed everything I needed to know. We were standing on a foundation built by decades of honest hard work, working the soil, and respecting the earth. The Evans family had built their foundation on lies, theft, and the exploitation of others. When the storms came, our roots held firm, while their entire structure washed away into nothing. They had constantly told me that farm girls did not belong at a proper table. They had tried to make me feel ashamed of the dirt on my boots and the calluses on my hands. But looking at them now, rolling on the floor covered in blood and sweat and public humiliation, I knew exactly who the dirty ones truly were. The reporters continued their relentless broadcast, shoving their microphones closer to the brawl, capturing the raw audio of the family tearing itself apart. A few journalists tried to shout questions up at me, standing safely behind my wall of corporate litigators, but I simply ignored them. My job here was done. I had delivered the truth, and I had provided the irrefutable evidence. The rest was up to the federal justice system and the court of public opinion. The piercing wail of police sirens finally overpowered the deafening chaos inside the grand ballroom. The flashing red and blue emergency lights reflected off the towering glass windows of the hotel, casting an eerie, frantic strobe effect over the violent scene unfolding on the floor. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room were suddenly thrown violently open. A swarm of federal agents poured into the event space wearing dark tactical gear with the letters denoting the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazed across their tactical vests in bold yellow print. They moved with terrifying military precision, completely ignoring the frantic reporters and the shouting investors. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, raised a megaphone to his mouth and ordered everyone in the room to stand back and drop their weapons. Julian and Darren were still locked in a desperate, bloody brawl, completely oblivious to the federal raid happening around them. Julian had his hands wrapped tightly around his brother's throat, screaming obscenities about the stolen $5 million, while Darren thrashed wildly, trying to throw a punch at Julian's bruised jaw. The investors who had surrounded them immediately backed away, raising their hands in the air to show the federal agents they were not involved in the physical violence. Two massive federal agents sprinted down the center aisle and threw themselves into the fight. They grabbed Julian by the shoulders of his ruined tailored suit and violently ripped him away from his brother. Julian let out a pathetic, startled gasp as he was forcefully spun around and slammed chest first against the nearest wood-paneled wall. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. The polished, arrogant wealth management lawyer, who had built his entire identity on the illusion of untouchable power, was now bleeding from his nose and being read his rights on live television. Darren tried to scramble backward across the carpet, his face bruised and covered in sweat, but another agent grabbed him by the belt and hauled him to his feet. Darren offered no resistance as his hands were wrenched behind his back and locked into cold steel cuffs. He simply hung his head in absolute defeat, knowing that his cowardly attempt to flee to the Cayman Islands had failed spectacularly. The reporters kept their cameras rolling, capturing every single humiliating second of the Evans brothers being reduced to common criminals in front of the very people they had defrauded. Up on the stage, the situation was just as chaotic. Brittany had managed to push herself away from the podium, her blonde hair hanging in a messy, tangled knot around her tear-stained face. When she saw the federal agents marching up the wooden stairs of the stage, she immediately reverted to her most reliable survival tactic. She tried to weaponize her tears. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic wail and practically threw herself toward the nearest federal agent, holding her wrists out as if she were a helpless hostage, begging for rescue. She began sobbing hysterically, claiming that she had absolutely no idea what her husband and brother-in-law had been doing. She swore to the agents that she had been manipulated and held captive by the toxic Evans family, and that the video showing her authorizing the offshore wire transfer was completely taken out of context. She pleaded with the agents, telling them that she came from a respectable, wealthy family and that she would never willingly participate in a federal Ponzi scheme. Her performance was so incredibly convincing that for a brief moment, one of the younger agents actually hesitated, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder to calm her down. Brittany looked up at the agent with wide, innocent eyes, believing that her fragile victim routine was going to save her from federal prison. She had completely forgotten who she was dealing with. I did not even have to speak. I simply gave a sharp nod to Denise, who was standing right beside me with the thick leather briefcase. Denise stepped forward, cutting smoothly through the crowd of journalists, and approached the lead federal agent. She did not raise her voice or engage in Brittany's theatrical screaming. Denise simply pulled a heavy sealed envelope from her briefcase and handed it directly to the agent in charge. She informed him that the envelope contained irrefutable physical evidence of the $5 million offshore wire transfer, including the digital signature authorizations and the private charter flight logs that Brittany had personally booked under a fake corporate alias. The lead agent opened the envelope, his eyes quickly scanning the detailed financial documents. He looked up from the papers and stared directly at Brittany. The gentle, comforting demeanor of the younger agent vanished instantly. Brittany's fake sobbing came to an abrupt halt as the lead agent grabbed her arm and forcefully spun her around. She let out a genuine scream of absolute terror as the cold metal handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. Her fragile white woman persona completely shattered as she realized that her tears held absolutely no power against federal wire fraud evidence. The journalists captured every single moment of her screaming and thrashing as the agents dragged her off the stage, her respectable old money facade completely destroyed. Beatrice was the only member of the Evans family who was not immediately placed in handcuffs. She stood in the center of the stage, shivering violently as she watched her entire world collapse into absolute ruin. She watched her golden son, Julian, being pushed toward the exit by federal agents, his face buried in his chest to hide his tears from the cameras. She watched her other son, Darren, being hauled away like a common thief, and she watched her precious white daughter-in-law, the woman she had practically worshipped and used to elevate her social standing, screaming obscenities as she was dragged out the side doors. Beatrice was completely, utterly alone. The massive Ponzi scheme was over. Her country club memberships were gone. Her high society friends were currently watching her destruction on the evening news and pulling away in disgust. The realization of her total destitution hit her with the force of a freight train. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the wooden floorboards of the stage, her expensive emerald green dress pooling around her in a pathetic heap. The ballroom was slowly clearing out as the federal agents secured the perimeter and began taking statements from the furious investors, but the reporters refused to leave. They kept their cameras trained on Beatrice, waiting to see what the fallen matriarch would do next. Beatrice slowly raised her head from the floor, and her wild, desperate eyes locked onto me. I was still standing near the back of the stage, completely surrounded by my legal team and untouchable fortress of power and composure. Beatrice looked at my tailored green suit, and the calm, confident expression on my face, and something inside her completely snapped. All of her pride, all of her racist, classist arrogance simply evaporated under the crushing weight of her impending poverty. She did not just walk toward me. She crawled. Beatrice Evans, the woman who had spent 5 years telling me that my rural heritage made me dirty, dragged herself across the stage floor, her hands and knees scraping against the wood. She pushed past the legs of the remaining journalists, ignoring the flashing camera lights and the disgusted whispers of the crowd. She threw herself forward until she was right at the tips of my leather boots. "Chloe, please," Beatrice wailed, her voice cracking and breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the fabric of my pantsuit, but my security guards immediately stepped forward, blocking her reach. She collapsed back onto her knees, staring up at me with a face completely ruined by running makeup and absolute terror. "Please, you have to listen to me, Chloe. You have to help us." Beatrice begged, the words pouring out of her in a frantic, unhinged rush. "The federal agents are going to take everything we have. They are going to freeze all the accounts and seize the cars, but they cannot take the ancestral Evans mansion. They cannot take my home, Chloe. The mansion is tied up in a separate holding trust, but the bank is calling in the mortgage because of the fraud investigation. The bank is going to foreclose on the property by the end of the business day if we do not pay the remaining balance. You have to save my home, Chloe." I stared down at her, feeling a profound sense of disbelief at her sheer, unadulterated audacity. This woman had banished me to a hallway. She had thrown my homemade food into the garbage. She had mocked my family and treated my history like a stain on her perfect life. And now she was kneeling at my feet, begging me to save the very house where she had abused me. Beatrice continued to sob, her tears pooling on the stage floor. "You have $180 million, Chloe," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the ballroom. "You have more money than you could ever possibly spend. The remaining debt on the mansion is nothing to you. It is just pocket change. You can buy the debt from the bank right now and stop the foreclosure. You owe this to us, Chloe. You are still my daughter. You are still a part of Black excellence, and you have to protect our legacy. Please, Chloe, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not let the bank take my home. Do not leave me out on the street." I did not move a single muscle as I listened to her. Pathetic, desperate, please. I let her cry. I let her beg. I let the cameras capture every single second of her ultimate humiliation. The reporters stood in stunned silence, completely mesmerized by the sheer dramatic reversal of power unfolding right in front of their lenses. Beatrice was weeping uncontrollably, her hands clasped together in prayer, looking up at me as if I were her ultimate savior. She truly believed that her emotional manipulation would work. She truly believed that the quiet, obedient farm girl she had terrorized for 5 years would suddenly feel a surge of familial loyalty and write a massive check to save her abusers. She thought the mention of Black excellence and family ties would somehow erase the years of relentless psychological torture she had inflicted upon me. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinner just 4 days ago. I remembered the way she had snapped her fingers and ordered me into the corridor. I remembered the sheer, suffocating arrogance in her eyes when she told me I did not belong at her table. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute reality of my power settle over me. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head slightly and gave a subtle, quiet signal to Denise, who was standing patiently at my right side. Denise did not hesitate. She reached into her heavy leather briefcase for the final time. She pulled out a thick, crisp, legal document bound in a heavy protective cover. The document bore the official seal of the Primary Lending Bank of Atlanta and featured a massive, bright red stamp across the top right corner, indicating that a foreclosure transfer had been officially executed. Denise stepped forward and handed the document directly to me. I took the heavy document in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper against my fingertips. I looked back down at Beatrice, who had suddenly stopped sobbing. She stared at the document in my hands, a glimmer of wild, desperate hope suddenly lighting up her tear-stained eyes. She thought the paperwork was a bailout. She thought I had already contacted my financial team to pay off her mortgage and secure her precious ancestral mansion. A wet, shaky smile began to form on her lips as she prepared to thank me for my incredible generosity. I looked directly into her eyes, ensuring that the microphones picked up the quiet, icy clarity of my voice. "Oh, Beatrice," I whispered, tilting my head slightly as a cold, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I already bought your debt." Beatrice let out a loud, ragged gasp of pure, overwhelming relief, fully believing that she had just been saved. The heavy tears streaming down her face transformed from tears of absolute terror into tears of profound joy. She clasped her hands together and pressed them against her chest, looking up at me as if I were an angel sent from the heavens to deliver her from the consequences of her own horrific actions. "Oh, Chloe," she wept, her voice trembling with a sickeningly sweet gratitude that made my skin crawl. "I knew you would not abandon us. I knew you would remember your place in this family and protect our legacy. You bought the debt to save my home. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you so much." The reporters in the ballroom pushed closer, their camera lenses zooming in on the dramatic reconciliation they thought they were witnessing. Julian paused in his struggles against the federal agents, a glimmer of desperate hope flashing across his bruised and bleeding face. He actually believed that his mother had successfully manipulated me into rescuing their fraudulent empire. I did not smile. I did not offer a hand to help the older woman up from the floorboards of the stage. Instead, I slowly crouched down, bending my knees until my face was perfectly level with hers. I leaned in close, making absolutely sure that the nearby microphones would catch every single syllable of what I was about to say. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and watched the initial spark of hope begin to falter under the freezing weight of my stare. "I did not buy your debt to save you, Beatrice," I said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom with a chilling absolute authority. "I bought your debt from the federal receivership as a hostile creditor." The collective gasp from the journalists in the room was immediate. Beatrix's smile froze completely, her hands dropping slowly from her chest. As the reality of my words began to penetrate her delusional mind, "I did not pay off your mortgage to keep you comfortable in the Buckhead neighborhood." I continued, letting the devastating truth sink into her bones. "I purchased the totality of your outstanding financial obligations. I am now the sole legal owner of the ancestral Evans estate. The luxury cars you leased, the fraudulent firm you built, and every single tangible asset your family ever claimed made you superior to me." Beatrice stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes bulged in her head, and her skin turned the color of old parchment. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, or to scream, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She was looking at a woman she had spent 5 years calling a dirty, uneducated peasant, and realizing that this very same woman now held the absolute legal right to strip her of every worldly possession she had ever valued. "You spent your entire life believing that your old money status made you untouchable," I whispered, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. "You thought you could treat me like dirt because my family worked the land. But you see, Beatrice farm girls know exactly how to deal with pests. We do not negotiate with them. We eradicate them." The sheer finality of my statement hung heavily in the dead silence of the Grand Hotel ballroom, sending a visible shockwave through the gathered crowd of terrified investors and frantic journalists who were eagerly documenting every single humiliating second of this historic downfall. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the red-stamped foreclosure document, holding it up so she could see the finalized legal signatures. "The foreclosure on the Evans mansion is active immediately," I announced, ensuring the entire room heard the final verdict. "The local sheriff's department is already at the property, changing the locks and boxing up whatever cheap knockoff designer items you have left inside. You have absolutely nothing left, Beatrice. You are homeless, penniless, and headed for a federal courtroom. All of your fake high society friends are watching this broadcast right now on live television, and they are watching you grovel in the dirt for the mercy of a black woman you deemed unworthy of your precious dining table. You built your entire miserable life on the backs of hardworking people, and now you are finally paying the ultimate price for your disgusting goose." Beatrix's eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed completely, fainting dead away onto the wooden floor of the stage. Her expensive designer handbag slipped from her limp fingers and spilled its contents across the dusty floorboards. Julian watched his mother hit the ground and lost his mind completely. The federal agents began dragging him toward the service exit, but he dug his heels into the carpet, thrashing wildly against their grip. "Chloe!" he screamed, his voice tearing through the ballroom in pure, unfiltered agony. "Chloe, please do not do this to me. Chloe!" His desperate, pathetic cries echoed off the walls as the heavy doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his final pleas for mercy. I did not look back at him. I slowly stood up from my crouched position, smoothing out the front of my emerald green suit. I looked down at the unconscious woman on the floor. I stepped carefully over her dropped designer handbag, making sure not to scuff my leather boots. Denise and my legal team parted seamlessly to let me through. I walked off the stage and headed straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, the rhythmic clicking of my boots echoing cleanly against the marble floors of the lobby. The cameras flashed one final time as the farm girl walked out the front doors, leaving the ashes of the Evans family empire entirely behind her. The legacy of the Evans family was now officially declared dead. Exactly 1 month had passed since the explosive press conference that completely annihilated the Evans family empire. The crisp morning air in the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta felt remarkably different today. It was no longer heavy with the suffocating arrogance of old money elitism. I stood on the immaculate manicured front lawn of the sprawling estate, breathing in the fresh breeze and watching the systematic dismantling of a fraudulent legacy. A fleet of massive white moving trucks was parked along the circular driveway. Dozens of professional movers were currently hauling out every single piece of expensive antique furniture that had once filled the interior of the mansion. I watched passively as they carried out the heavy mahogany dining chairs, the delicate crystal chandeliers, and the priceless oil paintings that Beatrice had valued far more than her own children. Every single item was being carefully cataloged and loaded into the trucks to be auctioned off to the highest bidder to help pay back the innocent investors the Evans family had defrauded. Standing just outside the tall wrought iron gates on the public concrete sidewalk was Beatrice. The former matriarch of Atlanta high society was completely unrecognizable from the woman who had demanded I eat my Thanksgiving dinner in a dark hallway. She was currently living in a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the city while awaiting her federal trial for conspiracy and wire fraud. Her frozen bank accounts meant she could no longer afford her expensive salon treatments or her designer wardrobe. She stood on the sidewalk wearing a wrinkled, faded cotton dress and practical flat shoes, looking small and utterly defeated. She clutched the iron bars of the gate with trembling hands, watching absolute agony as the auctioneers placed bright red inventory stickers on her beloved status symbols. She watched her entire identity being boxed up and shipped away. I stood on the grand front porch and looked back at her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. I felt only the cold, satisfying reality of justice taking its natural course. Beatrice had built her entire life on the exploitation and degradation of others, and now she was finally experiencing the exact level of humiliation she had so freely handed out to me. The quiet morning was suddenly interrupted by the loud, deep rumbling of heavy diesel engines approaching down the street. A specialized construction crew rolled up to the front gates driving a massive bulldozer and carrying heavy-duty demolition equipment. The workers parked their vehicles and the foreman walked up the driveway to meet me. I stepped off the porch and walked down to the front gates, completely ignoring Beatrice, who was still weeping quietly on the other side of the iron bars. I looked at the foreman and pointed directly at the massive, arrogant stone monument that stood at the entrance of the property. The monument bore the words Evans Family Estate carved deep into the expensive marble. I gave a simple, definitive nod. The construction crew did not hesitate. They fired up their jackhammers and swung the heavy machinery directly into the stone. The sound of the marble cracking and shattering was the most beautiful music I had heard in 5 years. I watched as the massive stone letters crumbled into dust and chunks of debris, falling into the very dirt that Beatrice had always despised. The crew worked quickly and efficiently, entirely erasing the Evans name from the neighborhood in a matter of minutes. Once the debris was cleared away, they brought out a sleek, modern plaque cast in solid, heavy bronze. The workers carefully mounted the new plaque onto the remaining brick pillars, securing it firmly in place. The bronze metal caught the bright morning sunlight, illuminating the freshly engraved words. The plaque now read the Jackson Agricultural and STEM Foundation headquarters. I stood back and admired the new sign, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of pride swelling in my chest. I had not just purchased this property to leave it empty or to live in a hollow mansion. I had used a fraction of my $180 million lithium contract to completely purify this space and transform it into something fundamentally good. The very house where I had been emotionally abused, racially degraded, and treated like an uneducated peasant was now officially a fully funded scholarship center. The Jackson Foundation was dedicated entirely to providing full-ride academic scholarships and housing for rural Black youth who wanted to pursue advanced degrees in botanical science, agriculture, and green energy technology. I was taking the generational wealth of my ancestors and using it to elevate the exact same type of hardworking, grounded people that the Evans family had spent their entire lives looking down upon. The ultimate revenge was not just destroying their toxic empire. The ultimate revenge was replacing their legacy of greed with a legacy of Black excellence, education, and community empowerment. I turned my back on the front gates and walked through the heavy front doors of the mansion. The interior was no longer a cold, sterile museum of stolen wealth. The house was currently buzzing with vibrant, exciting energy. Contractors were already busy knocking down the restrictive walls and transforming the formal living rooms into open, collaborative study spaces and state-of-the-art science laboratories for the incoming students. I walked straight down the main hallway and entered the massive formal dining room. The room looked completely different now. The small, flimsy folding chair that Beatrice had forced me to sit in was long gone, tossed into a dumpster weeks ago. The long mahogany dining table remained, but it was no longer a place of exclusion and elitism. The table was currently surrounded by life and joy. My mother and father were sitting near the center of the table, looking incredibly proud as they reviewed the first batch of scholarship applications from eager young students across the state. Denise and my elite legal team were sitting across from them, laughing and celebrating the successful launch of the nonprofit foundation. Several brilliant young Black students who had already been accepted into the early program were walking through the halls carrying textbooks and talking excitedly about their future research projects. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, and deeply rooted in genuine love and mutual respect. I walked to the very head of the massive dining table. I pulled out the large ornate chair that Beatrice had always claimed as her own undisputed throne. I sat down in the chair, feeling the smooth wood beneath my hands. I looked around at the beautiful faces of my parents, my friends, and the brilliant students who would soon change the world. I reached out and picked up a crystal glass filled with sweet iced tea. I leaned back in the chair and looked out the large bay window, watching the bright Georgia sun shining down over my new property. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my drink, letting the cool liquid wash away the last remaining traces of the past 5 years. Julian and Beatrice were gone forever, their names erased, and their power completely broken. The farm girl did not just earn a seat at the table. The farm girl now owned the entire table and the house it sat in. The greatest lesson from this story is that true wealth is never measured by designer labels or elite zip codes. Real power comes from staying grounded in your roots and refusing to shrink yourself to fit into toxic environments. The Evans family built their identity on arrogance and lies, and it cost them everything. Chloe showed us that when you stand firm in your truth, you do not just defeat your abusers, you build a legacy that uplifts your community. Please share your own experiences in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of reclaiming your life.